I would like to welcome you to the next talk, and especially welcome Professor Robin Hanson, who is a professor at George Mason University, and he's an author of two interesting books, which are, of more books, but two of which are here. And they're both very interesting and very different. The Elephant in the Brain is about the hidden motives in our brains, in our minds, and tells about the reasons that we think we do some things is not the reason we that is really behind our actions. The Age of M is a very interesting book, and it talks about an future scenario where emulations of human brains become possible and how it will change society. If you like to read science fiction, this is similar, but it's not science fiction. It's more like an interesting textbook-like or scientific examination of this scenario. But many of you will probably know Robin Hanson because of his concept of futarchy, which is a way to use prediction markets to discover the best possible policies and scenarios in governance, but also in companies. And what I really like about his ideas is that, as Paul Rosenberg said, if we are going to opt out to something, we should really think about what we are opting out to. And Robin Hanson has some very unique and clever ideas that we should really consider about how this new society that we are going to opt out to should look like. And we should consider these options, which are not very intuitive. Well, many people would not just make them up. It really takes a lot of effort to come with such unique ideas. And what's interesting is that they might actually work. So please welcome Professor Robin Hanson.
Thank you. Right. I didn't get the memo on the dress code. And I'm not going to talk about crypto. I'm going to talk about an idea for how we could radically change a part of society, but I don't know how to do it by opting out, sorry. So the story here is that in the old Soviet Union or China, they had the government run the food system, and the government told you what food you were going to get every week, and they decided what food to make and how to make it. And that's a very inflexible system that doesn't allow you individually to adapt to your preferences, and it doesn't allow a lot of innovation. And that's what we've been doing with the crime system for centuries now. It's been a very centrally run government system where everybody has to get the same system in the same way, and it doesn't allow much innovation or adaptation. And the idea is to do something a little better or different. So law has been around for at least 10,000 years. And the basic structure of law through almost all that time, almost everywhere, has been relatively simple. There's some sort of a judge, and then there's two sides, a complainer and a defendant. And these two sides have been treated equally, typically in history. They each have to go do whatever work they can to collect evidence, make their own arguments, and then if one side wins, the complainer wins, usually the other side has to give them cash. And that's been the system for a long time. It has some problems of you need some money to be able to sue. You might try to make up evidence. And as we'll talk about, people might specialize in trying to get away with things. But in the last few centuries, we invented and have adopted a new crime system. This new crime system, instead of having laws that come from tradition and general cultural perception, it comes more formally from agency rulings and legislature rulings. It tends to be focused on intentional harm. It tends to have two sides being an ordinary person and the government. And if there's a victim, they're not really involved in the process very much. And the government hires this prosecutor, they hire detectives, they set up all that side of it. They use all of their budget to push on one side, and the other side maybe gets a public defender who mostly says you should settle. And then the government punishes by choosing and paying for prison or other sorts of punishments. Why is crime law different? Why did we make up this new system? What's the point? Well, law is relatively easy when the thing that goes wrong arises out of ordinary interaction. So if your neighbor's tree falls on your yard, they didn't do it on purpose, they weren't planning it. You know your neighbor, you can find them, you can find evidence about them, they can't easily run away, you can get their assets. Ordinary law works pretty well for that case. But if you think about a bandit, say, who hides out between the towns waiting to pounce on people, there's somebody who are specializing in trying to get away with things. They're choosing a lifestyle where they hide themselves, they hide their assets, they hide evidence about them, and that makes it harder for the usual legal system to deal with the bandits and other people who specialize in crime. So in the ancient world, they just turned up some knobs to deal with that, which dealt with it okay. They killed people sometimes. Or if you couldn't pay a fine, they would sell you into slavery. They would hold an entire family clan liable for any one of them and what they did. And clans wanted to produce reputations for being treated well, and so they often put resources. And for the most part, that worked out. That is, they could discourage some relatively large harms through those mechanisms. But in the last few centuries, we've been reluctant to adopt those things. We don't sell people into slavery anymore. And so instead, we adopted this police system which is focused on these kind of specialists, people who are trying to get away with things. And so the government puts money into trying to find them, and the government puts money and effort into catching them and punishing them, and if they don't have money, we can use other forms of punishment, and that's been a way to deal with crime, to deal with this aspect of people specializing in getting away with things, which the old legal system didn't do so well for. Now, this crime law system has a number of major problems that you're probably aware of. The government is powerful, and it's corruptible. So the police get a lot more budget than the defense, even a public defender. There can be bad incentives when the government gets money from things, like often in history they have made things up so they could get more revenue, or prison labor. There's a lot of parties in the government who can just excuse people from crimes. Not just the police, but the prosecutor. All sorts of people along the line can just say, nope, you're off the hook, because they choose not to prosecute or pursue. And as you may know, the police often create a blue wall of silence, where whatever rules they're supposed to follow, if they don't follow them, the other police don't catch them on it. They don't pursue them. And in particular, say, in many police departments, the Internal Affairs Department, whose job it is to catch and find when police do things wrong, they report to the same chief of police who would be embarrassed if that were to become public. And so we have police who don't necessarily have to follow the rules. And this ability to push for plea bargains gives prosecutors enormous threats. They can take any one person and say, we're going to throw the book at you unless you give in, and they can take any of your friends and demand that they give evidence about you unless they'll push them, and this becomes a very powerful force. So we know that we've tried to limit the force, but it's been awkward. We hold a higher standard of proof in the government. We avoid, say, using fines or prison labor. We have rules of what police are allowed to do. We have some rights that we put in constitutions, but those rights aren't actually enforced very well. And this entire centralized state-run system, again, it doesn't adapt very well to individual circumstance, and it doesn't innovate very well. It's just a central bureaucracy. So I'm going to describe an alternative proposal, and I'm going to give the name vouching to it. And it's going to be inspired by lots of examples of vouching. In the ancient world, often a stranger comes to town. We're not sure we trust the stranger unless somebody in town says, I vouch for them. If they do something wrong, I will stand in for them. We do that today in computer security. So we do that today with bonded contractors, debt co-signers. Happens in the mob, maid guy, vouches for somebody. We tend to require liability insurance. If you're on the road and you have a car accident, you have to have this insurer ready to vouch for you, basically, to pay on your behalf for somebody else's harm if you caused them the car accident. This is the key idea I'm going to build on. I'm also going to, on the side, build on the idea of bounties, that we could enforce things by putting up bounties and having private parties enforce by collecting evidence and then collecting the bounty when they convince the courts that something's true. So, if I'm going to make a big, crazy proposal, I shouldn't propose to change everything. That should be a basic principle of proposing change. So I'm going to draw a line around what I'm not changing. And then I'm going to change things inside that circle. And I'm not saying we shouldn't change things outside the circle. I'm just saying for modularity purposes, I'm going to focus on this change. And then later on, we can change other things. So what's inside the circle? What's outside? Outside the circle is, what is a crime? Are drugs a crime? Is prostitution a crime? I'm going to leave the government still making that decision. Still leave the courts deciding, are you guilty? There's a court. You go to the court. You present evidence. They still make that decision the same way to decide, are you guilty or not? And the government, again, sets priorities like we do now, but more explicitly. Which kind of crimes are we trying to discourage how much? And which kind of crimes are we going to make sure we catch and detect if they happen? That's what's outside the circle. We're going to leave that the same. Inside the circle, what I'm changing is how we punish people, how any one person gets punished for any one thing, what sort of limitations there are on individuals' freedom, what kind of evidence can you get about people, do people have curfews, etc., what kind of privacy rights people have, who can check your emails, etc., and how we decide to investigate any one potential crime. Who decides what a priority is, how they go about it, what resources they put in. Those are all going to change. All right, so my proposal has three main parts. The first and the key one is everybody must get someone to vouch for them, to cover all of your legal liability. That is, if somebody sues you and wins, they stand ready to pay. They're on the hook to pay. And until you get a new voucher, they're still on the hook. So it's a long-term commitment until you get somebody to switch. And because this voucher is standing ready to pay, the official punishment for all crime can be a fine. That is, the voucher pays the fine. But that's not the end of the story. You and your voucher had a contract, and that contract specified what happens to you when you're caught and found guilty. So that contract could specify prison, it could specify torture, exile, whatever it is, and we will enforce that contract. You chose, with your voucher, what would happen to you if you were caught and found guilty. In addition, you and your voucher decide monitoring. What sort of evidence can they get about you? Do they get to read your emails? Do they get to limit your behavior, where you can go when? That's part of the contract. And you can also pick co-liability. You and a group of friends can say, we will be liable together. If any one of us is found guilty, we will all be punished. And that would also convince the voucher that they should offer you a lower premium, because they're going to charge you for this. They're on the hook to pay money on your behalf, so you're going to have to pay them a premium for them to be your voucher. And you're trying to figure out with them, how can we lower premiums, which is the same as how can you convince them that you're not a high risk, that it won't happen. So that's the idea with a voucher and fines. And the last part is every crime, when they're found guilty, a fine is paid, and part of that fine can go to pay a bounty hunter. And so now, the way the crime is caught is everybody who has reached the qualifications is entitled to go looking for crimes. And if they find one and collect evidence and can come to the court and convince the court that that crime actually happened by that person, then they get paid the bounty. And so now the blue wall of silence is broken, because if you're about to get a big bounty that you've been working months on, you're not that inclined to give it up because some other guy in blue says, please, please. You will want your bounty. And of course, this means laws will actually be enforced. There could still be discretion by judges in terms of whether someone's guilty or how strong the punishment should be. But the police, the prosecutors, the other parties, they're not going to be exercising discretion. They're going to be enforcing the law as written on everybody, whether you're rich or poor. So what are the advantages here? We're going to cut corruption and bias. We're going to enforce all the law. It's going to be on everybody equally. Today we have a big problem that when people go suing, they look for deep pockets. If there's any big company associated with something that went wrong, they go sue them, even if they were only tangentially related, because, hey, you got to sue the deep pockets. Now everybody has a deep pocket. Everybody who's involved in anything potentially has a deep pocket. So the courts can come after whoever's actually responsible. You'll be able to search in this big space of possibilities to find ways that actually are effective. So many people say, and I believe them, that prison isn't actually very effective at deterring a lot of people from crime. What is? The vouchers and their clients will search for finding ways, well, what will discourage them? And in essence, many of the things we now decide with constitutional rights that we all have to decide together, when are police allowed to look in a car or et cetera, now you will decide that with your voucher. You will decide what constitutional rights you have. And if you want more than other people, you can pay for them. You're going to have thought of problems here. Yes, we can think of things that could go wrong, but let's go through them. Obvious one, people say, well, if it's a fine, then rich people can just pay the fine and they get excused, right? But as you know, in many European countries, I don't know if here, fines can vary with income or wealth. So sometimes a speeding ticket is so many days' income worth of a fine. So the rich don't get off if the fines vary with wealth or income. We might worry that people would make bad choices in choosing clients. We could regulate that as we regulate many other choices. What if clients don't understand the contract? It's a big decision to make, perhaps early in life, so maybe we make them get tests, regulate that, make sure people are clearly making a knowledgeable choice. Do we think vouchers will collude? We can use antitrust law. How do we know that everybody has a voucher? It's important that everybody does. I think it's feasible. Like today, pretty much all cars have a license plate because it's visible. We could do things like that with, say, RFID tags. You might worry, well, won't hunters make up evidence in order to win cases? Well, of course, but that's been the ancient legal system for 10,000 years. The courts have always had to be skeptical that this person suing to get money might be making stuff up. So the courts should continue to be skeptical when one side sues and asks for money that they might be making stuff up. Of course, if we're only changing things inside the circle, we're at risk for things outside the circle being wrong. So if it's bad to have drug laws, but we do, this system will enforce the drug laws. It will be more effective at making people stop using drugs when the law says you can't use drugs. This isn't changing everything. This is changing how we enforce crime, not how we choose crime law. I have lots of thoughts about that, but this is limited choice. Many people are worried that if there's less discretion, it won't favor them, because most people seem to think that when, say, a police officer pulls you over on the road, if they use discretion, that'll favor you. I don't know why most people seem to think that. Can't really be favoring everybody, but this would have less discretion. There's the obvious case of what happens to an ex-con who's poor. Somebody who has had a record of committing crimes, doesn't have a lot of money, they're going to be charged a high premium if they're getting the same contract as everybody else. But the system now allows us to vary the contract. So of course, if we feel sorry for this person, the rest of us could all subsidize this. We could all use redistribution and subsidize their premiums. That's always a possibility. But now we know we were doing it for a particular reason for a reason. We might choose who we want to subsidize and who we thought was worthy. But if their subsidy isn't enough, they can now choose to change their lifestyle to reassure us. So it's like choosing someone to go on parole. We can be convinced they are safe to go on parole? Well, now the voucher is basically saying, what sort of arrangement do I feel safe with? So for example, if you work on a remote logging farm, you only go into town once a week in an escorted group, they can read your emails, your premiums are going to be low. You'll be able to handle that. Are your freedoms restricted? Yes. But that was the whole point of, say, parole or things, trying to say, if you look like a bad risk, maybe we don't want to treat you like everybody else. Maybe we need to find a way to limit our risk. And of course, there's an issue of how exactly to set the fine versus bounty. If you set the difference between the fine and the bounty too different, you get problems in two directions. And so I'd rather keep those numbers close to each other, which is quite feasible. So I've just given you a crazy sounding proposal. You can't do it with blockchain that I know of. And it's not something a small group of people can necessarily do on big things. It's about crime, which is something that large societies do. I claim that we created the crime law system over and above the usual law system because there was a specialist in crime, people who went out of their way, like a bandit, to hide themselves, their assets, and their evidence. And so we created this centralized system, which we've had for centuries, where a centralized government bureaucracy makes all these decisions about what to investigate, how, who to let off, how to punish, etc. And that's not very conducive to innovation or adaptation to individual circumstances. And so I've proposed an alternative that still leaves the government in charge of what's a crime and whether any one accusation is correct and how to set the priorities for any one crime, which is the fine, how much we're discouraging it, the bounty, how much we make sure we find it and catch it. And within those priorities, we're changing and privatizing, basically, how we discourage crime and how we detect it. Bounty hunters find the crime. Vouchers discourage the crime. Everybody must get someone to vouch for them. An ancient tradition, in many contexts, somebody vouches for you. Your voucher, basically the criteria for them is they have to have enough money to pay the fine. If they can't pay the fine, they can't be a voucher. But if they can pay the fine, they're qualified. You make a contract with your voucher that says, if you're caught, they pay the fine, but then other things happen to you. And even before you're ever caught, they may have access to your emails, they may be able to give you an ankle bracelet, whatever it is that you and they can agree on. The rest of us can say, you guys have the incentive to reduce these fines. We can trust you to make those choices because we're covered. If something goes wrong, we're paid the fine. And we know that you don't want to pay the fine, so you're going to try to find a way to make that not happen. And then we can get rid of the blue wall of silence. We actually enforce whatever laws we put on the books. We actually can adjust the parameters. Whoever we think is a larger crime, we can change the fine. Whatever fine and the bounty, these knobs of the fine and the bounty, they can be adjusted for individual circumstances in terms of time of day, kind of victim, etc., as we like. That's all part of outside the circle I've drawn. Inside the circle is how we respond to those choices, how we discourage crime. Maybe we can let you choose with your voucher how to ensure the rest of us that you will not commit crime. And that's my proposal.
Thank you very much. There are questions back there. Okay, wow, so many questions. Okay.
You were paying attention.
Well, so I'm gonna front run. Okay, so my first question is if you can tie this to the concept of futarchy and maybe describe it. My idea would be, can vouchers make decisions based on prediction markets on what your premium is, for example? But maybe
so I would rather go in the direction of choosing the laws and crime and fine levels from futarchy. That is, futarchy is a way to use betting markets to choose laws so that we get an outcome. So we decide what we want as the outcome. It might be GDP plus leisure plus whatever it is. We agree together on what we want society to do, what we want the result to be, and then we use betting markets. We basically ask speculators, somebody makes a proposal. If we adopt that proposal, well, on average, we think we'll get more of the thing we want. And if the speculators say, yep, we'll get more of that if we raise the fine on murder or lower the bounty on murder or whatever it is, then we just do that. So this would be a flexible way to choose all these crime laws with the eye toward producing some outcome. And so then we're not based on ordinary voters' misconceptions of how the world works. If in fact raising the punishment on murder doesn't actually help, then we wouldn't do it. Making drugs illegal, if that doesn't actually help to get the outcomes we want from society, then we wouldn't do it. We wouldn't be based on ordinary voters believing that drug laws would help. It would be based on what speculators think, who know a lot more.
Okay, thank you.
Hey, Robin. A quick question for you. This is based on what I understand of your proposal. The assumption here is you're kind of assuming there's an information symmetry. Generally speaking, in governance, there's an information asymmetry. The people who enforce have higher information. Say, think about the government. They have more information about everything than an average citizen. So if you are proposing such a proposal that you're proposing currently, do you think it's going to work?
I'm not understanding. So information asymmetries are all across life everywhere. They're in the current criminal law system. They would be in a new one. So what asymmetry do you think is the particular problem?
If you want to enforce in any sense, it assumes that the set of people who are saying that something has been broken has access to the bigger picture, whereas on an average, if you are a citizen or an average normal person, the resources that you have at your disposal to do the discovery is bounded.
So in the traditional legal system, if you want to sue somebody, it's your job to go collect evidence and their job to collect evidence, and then you present the evidence to the court, and the court makes the decision. Obviously, initially, people don't know things. They go collect evidence, and the information asymmetry is reduced via the process of collecting evidence and presenting it to the court. That's how the legal system has worked for 10,000 years, and it works for everything else other than criminal law just fine, and it even works okay in criminal law. So we have the standard system for dealing with information asymmetry, i.e. detectives go detect evidence and information, they collect it, they present it to a court.
Okay, I probably got it wrong then, sorry.
I have two questions. The first one is when somebody cannot find a person who vouch for them, what happens? You said about this license plates, but if I don't want to have a license plate, I just don't buy a car. And if I just can't find anybody who vouch for me, what do I do? Do you suggest there will be do you suggest there will be a public option like with health insurance, which Bernie Sanders proposes?
So those were the two questions, right?
No, it's the first one, sorry.
But
what happens if I can't find a person who vouch for me?
and then you also asked about the IDs.
No, it's just
Okay.
consideration.
So you know, as you may know today, there are people in prison, and then we ask, should they be paroled? And sometimes they say no. But that's a very bureaucratic, centralized decision process. Here, it's a much more flexible process in the sense that you have to get the previous people who had the decision to agree. So the two basic options for long-term commitments are, one, we have a public option, as you mentioned. There can be a waiting area concept, a place where if nobody will vouch for you, you go there, and it's not very pleasant, but you hopefully for a while find a way to get somebody to vouch for you. Or we just make it be long-term contracts, which I find more attractive. That is, say at the age of 18, you get a voucher, and this voucher is stuck with you until you can get unless you can get another one. They can't walk away.
Government issued voucher.
Say again?
Government issued voucher.
No, not government issue.
Who will issue it?
So at some early stage in your life, your parents will get you a voucher, and this voucher is yours for life.
I'm an orphan.
Say again?
I'm an orphan.
That's a pretty small edge case here.
Yeah, but still, there's
Your
some
orphanage, wherever you are surviving, then will get you a voucher. Or that is, having a voucher is part of being an alive citizen in this society. You need food, you need a place to live, you need a voucher. It's one of the things everybody
I'm not speaking about like the majority of society, but obviously there will be some like small minority, probably very small minority, probably just like thousands of people, like in single-digit thousands, who cannot find anybody who vouches for them. What happens to these people?
As you said, a public option is one option.
Okay.
I favor a different option, but that's a slight detail.
The second question, you said that rich people pay higher fines. Today, which I do not find very good, but still, rich people have to disclose, like everyone has to disclose their income to the state in their income declaration, like tax declaration. And the state knows who is rich and who is poor, and if state finds on the basis of the income or wealth, it has information provided by a person, and if the person doesn't provide the information, he becomes criminal. So in this system, how do we know how much money a person have? Should he disclose it publicly, or how it works?
That choice is independent of my proposal. So the current system, if it punishes you, it could make that punishment contingent on things like your wealth, but then it will need to find that out somehow. And that's also true of this alternative. whatever the fine is dependent on, they will have to know that thing in order to set the fine dependent on it. That means they will either have a regular records to it or get records in this context to find out. That's just generically true of legal systems. They can only make rulings based on things they know.
Yeah, but the difference is that today I disclose my income information to the agents of state who are obliged to keep it secret. And in this system, well, I'm not sure, but it logically follows, maybe there are other ways, but it logically follows that I should disclose it publicly to everyone to know how much money I earn.
I don't see that. So today, again, there are countries where you have fines depending on your wealth. The courts, when they implement those fines, they have to find out your wealth. Presumably, they look up the government records. Yeah. This isn't any different. Again, if you're going to have a fine depending on something, information, they'll have to have that information or have a way to get it. That's just true of the system today, of this system, of any other system we could possibly imagine. So it's not a reason to like or dislike the system, because that's just a common feature of all legal systems.
Thank you.
But the court in your proposal is still run by state.
Yeah, the same court. So I'm not. That's outside my circle.
Yeah.
How courts are run, who sets those decisions, that's outside the circle.
So basically, you have proposed a system where most citizens will be subject to mega corporations who run the vouching systems, because surveillance has a severe economy of scale, which means that it is very profitable and very logical that the surveillance of normal population is centralized in large corporations that basically can then make their own rules. So basically, in a sense, what you have proposed here is the abolishment of basic human rights to large corporations that are essentially immune to checks and balances.
I think you are making the concern of number 4. What if the vouchers had such enormous scale economies that there were a small number of vouchers and they therefore didn't compete very well and they took over and ran everybody? So today, private police and private detectives and private insurance is a pretty competitive industry. It's not taken over by a small number of huge firms. Today, in these industries, they have a lot of competition. I don't see any reason to expect that to change here. But if it did, we could use antitrust law just as we would for any
as
other
well as we do
industry.
today for Facebook and Google, which would be logical contenders to do exactly that because they have the data already.
I don't think being Facebook helps you be a voucher. I really don't.
It's nothing else but an insurance system that you're proposing there, and that is exactly what Facebook and Google and whatever is getting into, because they have the data to calculate the better premiums, and the data gives them a competitive advantage towards newcomers on the market. That is why they're currently centralized.
I actually expect churches to have a competitive advantage here. Not Facebook. You're looking for an organization that you have strong ties with, where those people will actually watch out for you and intervene in your life if they see you going wrong. Facebook or Google are not those sorts of deeply involved people in your life.
Well,
think of your employer or your family or your church. Those would be the organizations that would be best suited to be a voucher, because they need to know, not just know things about you, they need to be involved in your life.
that is exactly what Facebook and Google are for the most people on this planet right now. I'm sorry. They have the closest relationship to most people right now.
I guarantee you that you don't have to choose Facebook for your voucher. If you don't like Facebook, don't choose them. If somebody else wants to choose Facebook, let them. But you have the entire world of organizations available to you to choose as your voucher. Anybody who has money to pay your fine can be a voucher. You pick anyone who meets that criteria. That's the rule here. You pick anyone who just has the money, they're willing to back you up, they're your voucher.
Okay, so what about celebrities? Like you mentioned churches. In America, you have these guys, the priests who run mega churches, and they have millions of followers. They can persuade people to vouch for them, and they can be untouchable because they have mission from Jesus, and millions of people vouch for their sanctity or whatever. And
if you can convince millions of people to hand you money every week, you've got a money pump, and that's a problem right there. This is only a side effect of that.
So
the
then
fact that you can use this big pile of money to pay for vouching is just a small thing compared to the larger problem that you've got all these people handing you money all the time.
Maybe there would be some guy who will persuade somebody to like vouch for them, and then they will kill people live on the live TV, and you know he's untouchable because of.
If we don't like that, we can raise the fine for killing people on live TV. We can raise it as high as we like. Turn that knob to the max. You know, that's outside the scope of my proposal. Deciding that that's a bad thing and you want it to stop is just
one more edge case from the boundary of inner and outer circle. So if you have, like, for example, a bunch of hobos on the street, and who checks for them? Who asks them who vouches for you, guy on the street?
So it's worth remembering what the existing legal criminal law system is like. Remember? So police have rules they don't have to follow. They can be bribed. You can be pressured into admitting guilt when you aren't guilty because you can't afford to sue the police, who have a lot more resources than you, and they can take any of your friends and make them testify against you by threatening them in the same way. That's the world you have now. I'm not proposing this as perfect. I'm proposing it as better than what you have now.
Hello, over here. Thank you for an interesting talk. Look, my concern, and I'd like to hear what you have to say about this, and this comes from 10 years of working in the police, is that there's a possibility that the system, if you overcome the logistical issues, might actually work too well. And so what do you think about the potential danger about the way this might create a world where there's every incentive to enforce every possible law and to create laws for everything that you can imagine, because now there's this humongous financial incentive on a meta level about what that might do for society?
So the whole world we live in is a set of systems. I'm changing one system within that world. If other systems are bad enough, that could be worse. So I have libertarian colleagues who think that in general, we should put bricks around the legs of the police. We should do anything we can, make them ride bicycles. Anything we can to make the police less effective would be good, because they don't think laws should be enforced. So if you're that sort of person, then you don't want a more effective criminal law system. You just want to throw sand in the gears of the machine. And I'm not throwing sand, I'm putting oil in the machine, making it run smoothly. But hopefully, we can fix the other problem in addition to fixing this problem and make better ways to choose the laws. And as was mentioned, futarchy is one of my best proposals for doing that. But yes, if other systems are bad enough, you might not want this to work. So for example, if your military commanders are too gung-ho to fight wars, you might not want them to have more effective weapons, right? But some people work on more effective weapons, thinking that their militaries aren't too bad. Another.
Yeah, hi. So yeah, loved your talk. Who vouches for the vouchers? So if you have a church, let's call it Scientology, for example, and
for example.
Yeah, for example, and let's say they actually vouch for all their followers, but then it's found out that they're actually conspiring, so they are. Like the church itself becomes liable for some criminal offense. So who would vouch for the church?
So I've chosen this word vouching because it has a nice emotional punch. But if you notice, technically it's an insurance company. And in insurance today, we have something called reinsurance. Most insurance companies don't just go based on their capital. They go on having a reinsurance contract to cover their risk, which is why you can trust an insurance company that might not be around if they're reinsured. So here, the vouchers themselves should be vouched. And there's a technical question of how exactly you set the maximum amount they should be, ready to pay. It's not clear there should be a maximum, but if there is, there's a question there. But the basic idea is the vouchers are vouched, just as today insurers are insured.
Hello, I'm here. Thank you. You have put a great proposal of privatizing law enforcement industry. I like it very much. How do you have a roadmap or an idea how to implement it without involving state or state legal system? Because existing police or law enforcement in general has zero incentive of doing this. Thank you.
Well, in general, for innovation, as with Voucharchy, I think the proper path is smaller to larger scale trials. So you don't go immediately to getting a new constitution that changes everything. You try smaller scale versions. So we do have a smaller scale version in terms of how we do automobile insurance, for example. We could continue to have other smaller scale versions. We could say have bounty hunters who get parking fines. We could move in those directions. There's a lot of margins on which we could slowly experiment more. Private organizations can use this when they have internal rules that they enforce. Even a church, for example. If they say anybody in the church who finds a violation gets paid a bounty, everybody in the church must have somebody vouch for them in order to cover what they might do wrong in the church, then a church could do things like this. There's a very wide range of possible trials. In my work on Voucharchy, I've found that it's relatively easy to give abstract arguments that persuade people. It's very hard to get them to actually move and do anything. And my hope is that by talking about crime, it's something people more emotionally care about, and they might actually do something because they have felt and feel the pain of being hurt by crime or being punished for crime. On either side, it's both sides are very painful, and maybe that emotional energy of just seeing how broken it is and it could be better would induce people to do more small-scale trials. But the possibilities are all over the map. One person suggested, which I do think makes sense, as a replacement for parole, but that requires more, again, government involvement into choosing. But you could think of, you first start this, a person who wants parole needs to get a voucher to convince the prison to let them out of prison.
Here. The person at the back that was working for the police, if I understood well, had a very similar question, but I think you didn't really answer. So I will double down and maybe rephrase. I think what you're proposing to me seems somehow like an interesting proposition, but based on the fact that we would all agree on what constitutes a law that we should respect or not. And I think it's not really the case, especially in democracies where, you know, every 5 years the laws might change and so on. And I take it as a given that a large part of the population is not agreeing on what law is actually should be respected or not. And when you privatized basically law enforcement, and when everyone has an economic incentive to spy on each other, I'm curious if you can comment on whether you explored in your thought experiments the impact on the basic social structures that we take for granted, such as friendship, group of friends, and so on. So I will just make a very practical example. If I go out and smoke a joint with some friends, because we all agree that the law is written that we are not supposed to smoke, but we're all fine with that, what would become of my group of friends if they all have an economic incentive to take a picture of me smoking a joint and then send that to a bounty hunter in a way that is anonymous? I would never even know which friend is betraying me. So, yeah, can you comment on
Yes.
what impact it would have on everything that we take for granted right now?
There's two issues here. One is what happens when law is more strongly enforced, and the other is what happens when your people around you might testify against you or give evidence about you. So on the first part, when something can be made more efficient, you can use that more efficiency in two different ways. So we could either keep the laws we have now enforced at a similar level and just greatly lower the cost we suffer from enforcing the law, or we could suffer a similar level of cost at enforcing the law and then have laws more strongly enforced. We can choose anything along that spectrum as our option. We don't have to change to a different world in terms of how often things get forced or caught. We could hold that constant and just greatly reduce how long people spend in prison and how much we're spending on that, et cetera. That would be one of the options. Now, today in law, you are all typically have to stand ready to testify against any of the rest of you with a very limited number of exceptions. So spouses or therapists or priests have some exceptions, but pretty much all the rest of you are compelled to testify against any of the rest of you if the police demand it and the courts demand it. So you're already in the situation where your friendships are threatened by the fact that you could each be forced to testify against the other. Now, we could, of course, in your contract with your voucher, you could specify that you don't have to testify against your spouse or whatever it is. That is, those are part of the parameters now that we decide everybody has to agree on together that you could now decide separately. Because the system allows you to choose the level of rights you have there, and then it compensates through the level of fine. You can decide if you want to protect you and your friends that way, you can do that, and then you may pay a higher fine. But you would probably actually get a lower premium in the sense that if you pick co-liability, say you and a group of friends say, we will each be liable if any one of us is caught. Now, you don't want to tell on each other, but you also want to prevent each other from doing things. So if you think about that counterfactual, you can imagine having less to fear from your friends and associates telling on you, but of course more to fear that they will pressure you not to violate crime laws, which would be good if crime laws were good, and obviously bad if crime laws were bad. But again, you don't have to change the level of enforcement of crime in general. You could just lower the cost that we suffer from enforcing the laws that we have.
I think the comparison or with car liability insurance is not correct, because in car accident, you're normally talking about not intentional accident. You don't go to run in someone intentionally, and car insurance, liability insurance covering the other party from not intentional damage, and that's one thing. And the other. I don't like the idea that you are putting in one bag the criminals and the people who would never think of doing any crime. And you automatically putting that light on every single one, saying you will have to choose a company which you will pay for to keep an eye on you, even if you never ever had intentions to doing something bad, which I don't have to today. And with your system, everyone with no intention will have to do it. Not only the crime potential people, but everybody, which is limiting all my things. Freedom.
If you don't want them mixed, we could have you get a separate voucher for unintentional versus intentional things. I'm not sure there's much advantage of separating those two, making you get two different vouchers for two different categories of things. But that would be possible if it just offends you to have those things mixed up. I mean, I think there's this key intuition that people often have today in terms of their relationship to states as citizens. So for example, one of the intuitions that people have about immigrants is, why should we put ourselves at risk to those people coming in here and then maybe committing a crime? That is, those people don't have the right to come and put us at risk. But you have the right, well, I'm a citizen, so I do have the right to put you at risk, in the sense that until I've actually done something, you can't at all consider the possibility that I might do something. I have the right to walk anywhere I want and do anything I want, and you just cannot limit my freedom above all until I actually do something. Whereas with the immigrant, you might say, they should have to prove that they are trustworthy before they're allowed to cross the border. So this proposal says we're going to treat everybody suspiciously. Everybody is going to be someone who might potentially do something wrong, and that we're all going to want them to assure us. And the fact that you are a citizen of the same nation does not give us more assurance than if you were an immigrant. We're just going to want everybody to reassure us you. And if you think about vouching through history, has definitely covered lots of cases where people do things intentionally. Vouching in history did not just cover unintentional things. Insurance even often covers intentional things, actually. But vouching definitely has covered intentional things. That was kind of the point often. What if this person from out of town intentionally does something to people in town? We need somebody locally who will vouch for them and cover that case where they do something unintentional, do something intentional. So yes, it's changing the default of how you're entitled to be treated. But of course, it's the equivalent in the sense if we subsidize you with a premium subsidy, that means that you can have a very lax plan, then it's kind of equivalent to the current system in the sense that you can walk around, do anything you want, and there's very few limits on your behavior. because this voucher is being subsidized, right? So with my proposal, there is the option to subsidize various people's premiums, and my proposal is independent of who you choose to subsidize how much. And so if there are some people say, you know what, that person was a soldier and they helped the nation, so they should get this entitled treatment of not being suspected, they should be above suspicion, fine. You can achieve that outcome through a subsidy. You say, fine, you get this public option, say, you make a public option for ex-soldiers who say, ex-soldiers get the public option, vouching that covers the following terms. That would be a thing you could do.
And people who don't intend to commit crimes pay for crime enforcement right now through taxes anyway.
Of course.
So
people who don't intend to have car accidents have to pay for auto insurance. People who don't intend to have their house burned down have to buy house insurance. Yes.
Yeah. One last question.
Or here. Yes. I have this concern, which is of economic substance, let's say. You know, the stagnation in the US, to some extent, the stagnation of income, let's say, of workers, to some extent is attributed to the lower mobility of labor. People are less willing to travel to other states where opportunity exists so that they can claim higher wages. Now, it seems to me that the system that you are proposing lowers someone's propensity to move to another place to seek economic opportunity, because in that place you're going to be a stranger. It would be much more expensive for this person to find a voucher. So there is this one thing that I'm concerned about, but also for countries that rely on tourism, like mine, that we accept 3 times our population for 1 week or 2 weeks, to visit our country. What would happen with those tourists? Who would provide them with this kind of coverage?
So as you indicate, tourists would also need to get temporary vouching. If they come into a place where everybody needs to be vouchers, then tourists would also need to be vouched. Someone was previously concerned about the vouchers being too large organizations with too much encompassing. You're apparently concerned about the opposite, that they'd be small organizations and wouldn't have a national scope. I would expect them to have sufficient national scope that you could move from one place to another and keep the same voucher. In fact, I specify that they be long-term contracts, and so the long-term contracts, unless the voucher specifically told you can't move, you could move, and then you'd still keep the old voucher. That is, they'd still be held to the contract. So again, my best default concept is, these are long-term contracts, you can get out of it, but they can't. And they're priced accordingly, and so you would have, if your contract gave the freedom to move, then you could move. And of course, all through history we have known that cities have been places where more crime happened, right? Why? Exactly because you can't know exactly everybody in the city and have a network of connections that will keep them in line. That is one of the costs of cities have long been, and it's a real cost, and it should really be taken into account.
Okay.
Celebration music for the end of the
celebration music. Thank you very much for your talk and discussion. And the next session here will be the movie Libertas and the presentation of the preliminary movie. So, thank you.
Didn't need a whole time, did I?